Hi, I'm Ari, I'm the Oak Witch, and welcome to my review of Cunning Folk and Familiar Spirits, Shamanistic Visionary Traditions in Early Modern British Witchcraft and Magic by Emma Wilby. So, I did a little poll on my Patreon page and you guys voted to see me review this book. Now, I have a lot of things I want to say about this book, so overall rating of this book, this is such a valuable book for anyone who wants an insight into the sort of historical practices in Britain and perhaps an insight obviously specifically into the Cunning Folk and familiar spirits. So the use of spirits, spirit work and guardian spirits that the Cunning Folk and witches in Britain had, what they incorporated in their practice. It's fascinating insights into this. I would say overall it's quite a slow-paced read. It is an academic book, so obviously there's academic language, and academic books aren't always the most accessible. So if you have struggled reading academic writing, obviously you will probably struggle with this one, but it's one of those books you really take your time with anyway. So this book is split into 3 parts. The first part goes over the historical context to the Cunning Folk and their sort of spirit helpers. So the fairy familiars for the Cunning Folk and the demon familiars for witches, and she analyses the similarities and differences between the two, if any. And here is what she all goes over. In the second part, she talks about anthropological perspectives. So this is where she goes into the comparisons of different sort of shaman healers from different indigenous tribes, and kind of just goes over those in a anthropological context. So she just goes over and she identifies them and just talks about them and analyses what these visionary experiences, these trance states, and sort of what that looks like. Let's just dive into the elephant in the room, and that is the term shamanistic. So as I said in my main channel video, I think it's worth considering that a lot of academic spaces utilise outdated terminology. I think academia should strive to be more progressive because language is really, really important in how we address groups of people and individual people and topics surrounding cultures that are, appropriated, that are marginalised. It's important that we use progressive language just to be more inclusive. And I think the use of the word shaman is not the best all the time. I think the use of the term shaman in New Age, in modern witchcraft, eclectic magical spaces, paganism, I think the use of the term shaman is largely one in the context of just appropriation. I think a lot of people tend to view themselves as, or view their paths as shamanic, which is mainly just another way of saying it's just appropriated indigenous and native practices. And I'm not really sure that's really appropriate, right? As far as I'm aware, the term shaman originated from Siberia, and now a lot of academic spaces use the term shaman to apply to a lot of indigenous and native cultures, worldwide. So I think Emma Wilby herself does actually acknowledge that the term shaman is largely diluted and has disputed origins, but she resorts to using it because she doesn't really know of a better alternative. Is that a good excuse? I don't know, but it's the one she gives. In this third part, she talks about the experiential dimension of these visions, these experiences that she's analysed, and obviously comparing them with the Cunning Folk experiences. And she basically just goes over explanations for what these experiences actually were. She argues that there is some mystical and spiritual aspect to these experiences, and this is kind of what she goes over in this third part. The book is really nicely laid out. As you can see, there's sort of images from pamphlets of witch trial stuff, and overall this is, although a hard sort of slow-paced read, it is quite nicely formatted. I think the only formatting thing I would say is where there is sort of early modern English or old English here, where she quotes specific witches or records. It is in this type of language, and that can be quite hard to read. There isn't a lot of context, only the odd words that are quite hard to interpret that she's given, but overall it's quite hard to read, so if you're not used to this type of language, then you probably will struggle. But what this book does, it gives such an important perspective when looking at the Cunning folk, who they were, and their experiences. What Emma Wilby actually outlines herself in this book is what happens a lot in historical spaces or sociological spaces analysing the Cunning folk and witch trial records. They dismiss a large proportion of the narratives, the experiences that these individual characters, these Cunning folk practitioners, these witches, who were persecuted, and the records that we have of them and what they have confessed to, their experiences of their magical practice. A lot of past historians and academics have very quickly brushed it off as, either nonsense, hysteria, delusions, signs of mental illness, or something which was forcibly confessed by these prosecutors. Emma Wilby doesn't deny these things. Rationally speaking, of course this did happen, but she also presents an additional perspective where she does talk about how the immediate dismissal of all of these experiences that we have in these records as something which is just unworthy of any examination or analysis into. She addresses a lot of nuance in these records, these confessions from these individual characters that we see. She gives specific examples and she goes over them in a way which really allows for magic, allows for a perspective that actually believes some truth to these experiences, which I think is really, really interesting. Specifically as well, talking about familiar spirits, which she calls encounter narratives. So past historical pieces of work have actually dismissed a lot of, or just completely omitted discussion of the Cunning folk's familiar. There's a lot of discussion about the witch's familiar, but there's not a lot of discussion on the Cunning folk's use of a familiar. And she then goes through this in this book and outlines how actually it was quite a key part of the Cunning folk's practice. And she sort of highlights how there is a presence of pre-Christian fairy folk beliefs that the general population of Britain had at the time, and how the confessions and the experiences that the Cunning folk and these witches spoke about in their sort of trial records, and that there is evidence of those beliefs in these confessions. And I think that's really, really interesting, because especially when we look at a lot of modern traditional witchcraft paths and folk witchcraft paths, it involves a lot of use of the witch trial records and how we can gain insight into how we can build our own magical witchcraft practices from those historical records. And I think a book like this outlining that actually there might be more mystical truth to these experiences than many historians actually let on. So I think that's very, very interesting. Some other points that she makes is how the dichotomy between the witch and the Cunning folk person wasn't as separate as you may think. It was very easy for a person to sort of slide along that scale of whether they were a Cunning folk person, so a good magical practitioner, or a witch who was a bad magical practitioner, and how it was very easy for someone to slide along that scale depending on numerous factors at the time, I think that gives a really interesting perspective into how a lot of academia actually separates the two, the Cunning folk practitioner and the witch, and how, they're pitted against each other and they're completely separate beings, but actually she sort of gives a different perspective to that, outlining how actually they might not be as dissimilar as you may think. They share a lot of similar practices, such as the use of a helpful spirit, and a lot of their charms may incorporate similar things. So all that sort of stuff she goes through in this book, which I think is really, really valuable, especially to the English folk witch who does pull from old cunning folk practices and old witchcraft practices. So very, very valuable stuff. Also, when she discusses this concept of pre-Christian indigenous fairy beliefs at the time, she discusses how it was heavily syncretized with the Christianity beliefs at the same time period. So she does an analysis into how the cunning folk practitioners at the time, of course, had that syncretism, but it wasn't something that was debated. They just believed that way. That was just normal for them to have those like folk beliefs syncretized to the, dominance of Christianity at the time period. It was just something that they did. And I think that's just really valuable, especially when we're looking at modern traditional witchcraft and folk witchcraft spaces, which does syncretize Christianity in their practices, especially when we see a lot of spells and charms that have Christian elements in them. So going deeper into this concept of shamanism, which she talks about in here. So what she does in the latter half of the book is discuss how we can compare the visionary experiences and counter narratives with spirits that the cunning folk have, there's evidence to that, and how that can be compared to shaman visionary experiences from different tribal cultures, from different indigenous groups. I'm not the authority here to say whether or not it was done respectfully. I am not a person from a native or indigenous group, so it's not really my place to say whether or not this gets a pass or not, but from my understanding, I believe that she has analysed and sort of spoken about indigenous groups in a way which is respectful, because I think she doesn't speak broadly of indigenous and native groups. She gives specific native names, tribal group names, locations, and of course it's heavily cited and referenced, and there's a great bibliography at the back that you can check out with a fantastic notes section. So it isn't done in a way which feels very sort of appropriated. She is talking very specifically about specific indigenous people that she's sort of analysing and comparing with the cunning folk. I think it is done in a nuanced way. I don't think she's saying they're exactly the same, because of course they're not. There is cultural nuance and differences that cannot be compared. But I think when we're looking more at just the general experience of trance-induced states and spirit work, I think it's quite interesting to see those comparisons, though they may not obviously be the exact same. Some downsides to this book, which I'll say, is obviously, as I said before, I don't like the use of the term shaman. I think I would have liked a bit more explanation into the use of the term shaman in modern spaces and why it's indicator of cultural appropriation in a lot of these modern magical traditions. This was published in 2005, so we could probably cut some slack due to its age, but I think that's still something I would have liked a bit more. I think there needs to be more discussion about that in our community, to be honest. But the main downside is probably the outdated terminology, probably the use of the word shaman, and there are some slurs used, such as the E slur for Inuit groups. It was referenced a few times, and there was the use of the term Indian in regards to Native Americans. So a lot of the time it is used in a citatory context, so it's her referencing other scholars that have used those words, but it is also from her own words as well, so it's just something to identify with and acknowledge as something which I don't really think is great, I think. But honestly, this book is so valuable. I spoke about this on my main channel video, but it's such a great book for understanding a different perspective to the cunning folk, to familiar spirits, to this old sort of magic, and how we look at these witch trial records. I think it's one of those things where you see a lot of historical books which are very much biased in the sense that the writer is obviously not a magical practitioner. They obviously are writing in a purely historical, objective way, and that means dismissing a lot of the magic which these confessions, these old trial records, these old practices are centered around. It's writing about magic from someone who obviously doesn't believe that the magic is actually real. So as a modern practitioner, it's not that personable. You know, you're not hearing a perspective that from someone that actually believes in your modern practice, even if they are being respectful in their historical analysis. I think Emma Wilby's arguments here are really for allowing the possibility of these experiences to be more than just a delusion or mental illness that many historians have sort of just brushed them off as before. She's allowing for those visionary experiences, she's allowing for belief, and I think that is really valuable as someone who is a modern magical practitioner. To read a historical text like this, to really be validated in a way, it's quite nice to hear a different perspective. So that's why I really like this book. It's a great read. It's, to be honest, there's not a lot of books talking about familiar spirits, and if you are really interested in working with a familiar spirit or spirits, then actually reading this can help you get a great insight into what that may look like, both historically and what you can apply to your modern practice as well. So this book is really great for that as well. My battery just died, so I'm just gonna do a quick outro like this. Hope that's okay. But thank you for watching the review. If you enjoyed it, let me know. I really appreciate it. If there's any books you want me to review, as always, please just let me know. Comment down below what you want me to review next, and I will do that for you. So yeah, thank you for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye.